All right, welcome back to Touchdown Talks. I'm Spencer Taylor. This is going to be my top 15 tight ends video for you here. We've already done running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks. So if you want to see those, if you're preparing for your fantasy draft, that's what these videos are for this week. If you want to see any of those, you can go to my channel down below, Touchdown Talks, and you'll be able to find those videos there. While you're at it, don't forget to hit subscribe, hit the notification bell. That way you won't miss any of my future videos. Do have 2 more after this coming for more fantasy positions, those being kicker and defense slash special teams. So I'll have those coming up for you as well. So you won't want to miss those. So hit those so you don't miss those videos. And then also, if you could, leave a like on this video for me. That'll help me out in the YouTube algorithm, help get this video to more viewers, and that'll help me also know that you enjoyed this content and you want more of it going forward. So, and then, also let me know down in the comments down below, what are your... This video is tight ends, so who are your top 3 tight ends for this year in football? Whether they're tight ends that you're planning on trying to select in your fantasy draft, or just in general, tight ends that you like to watch, the tight ends you think are the best. What's your top 3 down below? I'll be very interested to see your responses. But without any further ado, let's get into my top 15 list of the tight ends I think you should be prioritizing drafting in the 2025 fantasy drafts. So at number 1 on my list, I have Brock Bowers with the Las Vegas Raiders. Bowers is coming off a great rookie season for a tight end. In fantasy, he finished as tight end 1 in 2024, which is great for a rookie. That was in a season where the Raiders began with Gardner Minshew as their quarterback. So right off the bat, Brock Bowers going to get an upgrade at quarterback, an upgrade at head coach. Really, the Raiders going to be like Seahawks 2.0, it feels like. So, at those 2 positions, very key for the Raiders. Definitely an upgrade from 2024. So I think that could help Brock Bowers' potential out a lot. The Raiders also lost Devontae Adams, so as far as an offensive star talent, Devontae's gone, so Brock Bowers won't have to compete with him for target share. So I think Bowers is very easily poised for another great top 3 at least tight end performance in 2025, assuming he's able to stay healthy and those types of things. If he's able to stay available, he should be able to be a top tight end for you, and that is, of course, why his average draft position is what it is. Again, I have him at number 1 on my list. In average draft position for tight ends, he is going first overall for tight ends, and with an average draft position currently at about 22. So that's going to be in the second round for you, late second round really for the most part. But I do really want to preface with tight ends, kind of a similar position to quarterback. Similar but different. I say similar to tight end to quarterback in that it's more similar to quarterback for fantasy than it is to wide receiver and running backs. In that wide receiver and running backs, you really got to think about those positions. Those positions, there's more than half of basically everybody's roster and bench is going to be made up of running backs and wide receivers. So that's part of the reason why running backs and wide receivers, that part of it, and the amount of points that the top end players will score in that position on a consistent basis, that is why running backs and wide receivers go so highly in the draft. And of course, just why they're so commonly talked about for fantasy is because those positions are going to be, in a normal league on a normal size fantasy roster, you're going to have 2 running back positions, 2 wide receiver positions, and then a flex that could be wide receiver, running back, or in most leagues a tight end as well. But wide receivers, running backs, generally a little bit more consistent. A lot more of them that are going to be putting up high numbers on a week-to-week basis. So, that flex position, most of the time going to be wide receiver or running back. And then your bench, most of the time, a majority of your bench is going to be those. But so with tight end, it's a little bit more like quarterback in the sense that there's a lot less of them that are top end fantasy worthy in the position. And as far as how many you're going to want to carry on your roster on any given year, it's much less. For tight end, you really only want to carry one, maybe two tight ends at a time. It really depends on the tight ends that you have. Depends, it can also be different too. Like with all these positions, I might have one bit of a type of advice for you for the draft for that position, and then a different set of advice once we get into the season. But at least as far as drafting and building your roster in the initial phase, I would suggest really tight end. You really only need one. Again, maybe two, but generally I'm only taking one tight end in fantasy. Unless it's a year where tight end is looking super stacked, super full. But even those years where it's looking like that beforehand, it usually ends up not being the case. So with tight end, similar to quarterback, you have a couple of those top end tight ends, in the top 5, top 3, that are going to go really high. And then the rest, you might see some snowball effect, and you might see some tight ends get overdrafted. And in that case, if you don't want to get stuck with a fringe starting tight end, you may have to be willing to overdraft a tight end. And if you want one of these top 2 that is going to be a consistent tight end, or most likely to be, which for tight end, just overall, generally not a very consistent position. So if you want to make sure that your tight end position is more likely to be consistent week in, week out, less of a stress for you, you may want to go ahead and draft a Brock Bowers or one of these other 2 that I've got coming up soon. Obviously, it's not a guarantee. There's nothing guaranteed in fantasy, but or in football for that matter. But if you want the safest option at tight end, you're going to have to pay for it in a high draft pick that could otherwise go to a running back, a wide receiver, an early quarterback as well. That's the kind of price you're going to have to pay for these top tight ends. Might be worth it for you, just because tight end really, outside of these top 3, and really the top 2 this season, outside of that, tight end is a position that quite often with many tight ends can be like an every other week thing. Like your tight end might score, 15 or more points on week 1. Week 2, they score single-digit points, and then that pattern just goes on throughout the year. And that's unfortunately semi-common for tight ends to have that kind of a season. So that's why, these top-end tight ends will be high up there, and as a whole for the position, you're generally only going to want to carry one tight end because that's about all that's going to be worth it. Just the other positions are more valuable, going to yield you more points, and you also just need to fill more of those positions on your roster. So now moving into number 2, with all that in mind, I do have Trey McBride as my number 2. That is aligned with the average draft position for tight ends. He is going second, and his average draft position currently is at pick 27. So just about 5 picks behind Brock Bowers. But again, similar to quarterback this year with Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson. Similar, not quite the same, but chances are if one of these tight ends goes off the board, this year it's most likely going to be Brock Bowers going off first. If Brock Bowers goes off the board, chances are wherever he went off the board, Trey McBride is going to go, within the next 3 to 4 or 5 picks, Trey McBride is going to be gone as well. So whether that's a little bit early or not, doesn't really matter. If Brock Bowers gets picked, Trey McBride is going soon after. And again, it'll most likely be late second round, maybe early third round for you. Despite not being a starter in 2023 until week 8, Trey McBride finished 2023 as the 7th overall tight end for fantasy. And his target share went up to a high amount. And then, unfortunately, in 2024, he was kind of the poster boy for bad touchdown luck, totaling only 3 scores, 2 receiving and 1 rushing. Although he did finish second in the position for targets, catches, yards, and end zone targets with 10, and second in fantasy points, though. So, still 2023 on, he's been a top 2, top 3 tight end, and I do expect, this year for the Cardinals, I think it could be a decent year for them, certainly at least on offense. I think the Cardinals could be good this year. You got Kyler Murray, who, not necessarily the best quarterback in the league, but certainly a top half quarterback, has running ability, has the ability to throw the ball as well. Bit of a shorter quarterback is one of the knocks on Kyler Murray, but as far as when he is passing, since Trey McBride has really taken that starting tight end position for him, he's been really one of, if not Kyler Murray's favorite target. And then, of course, you do have Marvin Harrison Jr. there competing for targets as well. But Trey McBride really pretty much in 2024 and the end of 2023, Kyler Murray's favorite target. Trey McBride going second overall. That's where I have him as well. And then moving on to number 3, once again, I'm in line with the average here. Really with these top 3, top 4 tight ends this year, there's really not much to argue, in my opinion. I'm not going to try to think the room. I think the average draft position for these first few tight ends is pretty correct. So number 3 is George Kittle with the San Francisco 49ers. In 2023, he finished as the tight end 5, and in 2024, he finished as tight end 3. So he's been a top 5 tight end in the last 2 seasons. He's currently projected at a number that would finish him anywhere from about top 5 to top 7. So obviously being drafted 3rd, a little high for that projection. But I still think, though, with the type of tight end that he is, how good he's been year in, year out, basically all of his career, I think drafting him 3rd here is fair, being that he has been as consistent as he has. And as I said earlier, tight end for fantasy is just a position that is generally full of inconsistency. Even in a lot of these tight ends that end up getting drafted early on, it's quite often that at least 1 or 2 of them ends up having a very disappointing season, whether due to injury or just simply inconsistency and a weird year as far as targets or touchdowns, that kind of thing. Of course, with Kittle, the one thing is he is entering his 9th season. He's 31. He is going to have competition for targets, but at least starting out the year, the 49ers wide receiver room is pretty decimated, so that's going to help his target share. There is Christian McCaffrey back, but really Kittle is probably going to be Brock Purdy's number 1 target, at least to start out the season, assuming he is able to perform at a decent level at the age he's at. And even if there's a slight regression because of the age, I think we all do expect George Kittle, future Hall of Fame tight end, he should be plenty good this year. He finished with 236 fantasy points in 2024. Currently, the projection by ESPN has him dropping by about 10 points there, which would still have him as a top 5 tight end, or as I said, top 5 to top 7. But again, I would lean towards him being more of a top 5 or higher. So, moving on to number 4. Once again, I'm in line with the average here. Sam LaPorta with the Lions. He's going 4th for tight ends, 52nd overall, and my apologies for George Kittle. He's going at about 34 for average draft position. But for Sam LaPorta, down a little bit further at 52. Again, between the first 2 tight ends, not too much space in between them. Once Brock Bowers gets taken, Trey McBride is going soon after. And there could be a snowball effect with tight ends, but it's not usually quite as extreme as it can be with quarterbacks. Again, quarterbacks, one or two gets taken. Some fantasy managers are going to panic and feel like they need to immediately draft a quarterback afterwards. Tight end, not so much. People aren't going to overreact quite as much to that, but they still might. So for these, again, especially these top 5 tight ends, you may want to, if you want to have a consistent tight end or a more likely chance of having that, you may have to overpay for them a little bit. So Trey McBride, though, 52nd overall. He had a historic rookie season in 2023 and finished first overall for tight ends in 2023. In 2024, unfortunately, he hit a bit of a sophomore slump. While the beginning half of the season was the most disappointing part of it, the good sign is that from Thanksgiving on, he really did hit his stride again and was very consistent. In those final 6 games, he averaged 15 fantasy points per game. The low in that span was 10.4, and the high of those 6 weeks was 18.4. So really a pretty good consistent range in there for those 6 games. All numbers that for a tight end, at least for me, I would accept that. If I've got a tight end who is getting into double digits and they're doing that consistently week in and week out, and they've got some of those weeks where they're up above 15 points, that's great. Tight ends can have amazing weeks where they, get into the 20s, things like that, but that's pretty unlikely for tight ends. And again, with tight end, really, in my opinion, this is a position where I'm really trying my best to just get consistency. I don't want a tight end that is getting 15 one week and then 2 points the next week. I would rather have a tight end that is getting, if I have to, somewhere between 8 and 10 just every week. I just know where they're going to be. They're going to be pretty consistent. They're going to get an okay amount of points, not a ton, but I know where they're going to be at. I would rather that than one that's going to be all over the map. Moving on to the rest of the list, really from after this point, really it's after the top 4 here in 2025 that things kind of get a little bit more murky and questionable at this point. And this is where my ranking is going to start to diverge a little bit from the average, just because I disagree with some of the rankings that the general public is having, basically. But at the same time, though, pretty much any tight end after this, I'm not super confident in my rankings even, and I don't think anybody should be super confident in, projected numbers, things like that. Any tight end after this point is either going to be inconsistent or there's fair concerns either due to past injuries, their age, something like that. So starting off that, at number 5, we have Travis Kelce on my list. On average, he is going 6th for tight ends with an average draft position of 63. I've got him up here at 5. Future Hall of Famer, Travis Kelce. With that said, Kelce's years of being an elite fantasy tight end are likely behind us. Kelce's targets and receptions actually increased from 2023 to 2024, but he did regress in yards, touchdowns, and yards per target, all of which were career lows for him. So after finishing no lower than 3rd in fantasy in points per game in 8 straight seasons, Kelce fell to 5th, 7th in points per game in 2024. So, he was still a starting level tight end, just not the same as what he had been pretty much all of his career. He will benefit, of course, from having Patrick Mahomes as his quarterback. They've got, great chemistry, obviously, from all their years together now and all the success they've had. And being in a Chiefs offense that has generally been semi-pass prone, not necessarily been known for their run game. But at age 35, he is now more of a mid-range tight end 1 at best. Due to his the other thing with Travis Kelce too is due to his high levels of fame, Kelce's likely going to be getting overdrafted in a lot of leagues, especially this late into the process for fantasy. You're quite likely to be in drafts where he's going to get overdrafted, not only because of his fame on the field, but of course, if you've got a Swiftie in your league, this is going to be a spot where Travis Kelce may be going way higher than you'd be confident with taking him. Unless you are that Swiftie, I guess go ahead and take him. But if you do want to get him, his average draft position, 63 overall, going 6th on average for tight ends. Again, I think you'd be fair to take him as the 5th tight end off the board. But yeah, you may have to draft him semi-high and maybe higher than he's worth, just because he's got fame on the field. And not only that, but of course, as we all know, the news that broke everywhere, all the Swifties that got their news in a way they wouldn't have expected. Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift did announce their engagement recently, just this week. They got engaged a couple weeks ago. With that being announced and them being engaged now, that hit national news. But I do think it's funny, as a side note, that a lot of Swifties learned of her engagement through Adam Schefter and other sports journalists and things like that, and insiders. So pretty funny way for Taylor Swift fans to learn of her engagement. But for tight end though, Travis Kelce, again, been an elite tight end pretty much all of his career for fantasy. Outside 2024, still starting worthy tight end, but not to the same level. In 2025, I do expect there may be a bit of a regression here. So 5th overall may be fairly high. I have more confidence in Kelce than I do with some of my worries in some of the upcoming tight ends. But the average player and even some of the analysts don't seem to share my concerns with some of these other tight ends. So maybe fair for Travis Kelce to be going 6th or later as well. But again, for me, after the top 4 in tight end, it's kind of hard to really be certain. And anybody that's like very concrete in their rankings, don't trust them. They're just trying to sound confident. All of us are going to be wrong. A lot of this is luck with fantasy, but I don't think anybody can, with a straight face, be super confident in their rankings with some of these tight ends going forward. There's just too much inconsistency in questions for different tight ends year to year and week to week in fantasy. So at number 6 on my list, 7th overall on average, is Mark Andrews with the Baltimore Ravens. His average draft position is at about pick 73. Andrews managed to finish 8th in points per game after finishing top 5 in the prior 5 seasons. So also similar to Kelce, a little bit of a regression in that sense in 2024. He finished 6th overall for tight ends in 2024, so he did have a better overall finish than Travis Kelce last year, just by a little bit. Compared to earlier seasons, he had a lower overall target share, but he also did have a career high in touchdowns in 2024. He's going to need that to kind of reverse again if he's going to want to be a elite, reliable fantasy tight end in 2025. But still, I do think with his pedigree and the history he's had as a fantasy tight end, he'd be somebody that I'm more comfortable with taking in the top 5 for tight ends. Again, getting up there in age a little bit, but certainly not as much as Travis Kelce. Just has had some inconsistency a little bit more. So that's why he finds himself here at 6 on my list, 7 for the average. Moving on to 7th on my list, this is TJ Hockenson with the Vikings. And on average, he's actually going 5th. So this is why Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews were a little bit high for me compared to the average, is I've moved TJ Hockenson down 2 spots from his average. Because on average, he's getting drafted 5th. His projected fantasy total by ESPN is 184.8. In 2024, he only finished with 86.5 points. Now, that is largely due to missing a good portion of 2024. He did suffer an ACL tear towards the end of 2023, so that kept him out for a good portion of 2024. The good sign is that when he did come back in 2024, he had some okay weeks, but he was still very inconsistent and had some abysmal numbers in some specific weeks. And so that's why for me, I'm not willing to say I have very much confidence at all. Again, he's coming into this season healthy. If you want to take a look at things optimistically, which obviously we all do for players, we want to hope that they're able to recover from these types of injuries and get back to the way they were before. But there is always a concern, especially with an ACL tear, that they might not be able to get back to the form they were before. He just didn't have the level of production week to week when he was back in 2024 that I know he's had a whole off season, so may be able to be better, and he'll be starting out the season this year. So certainly has a chance to be a top 10 level tight end, and that's why even I do still have him at 7th. I'm just not confident enough that he's going to be good enough to be top 5. So that's why I couldn't put him at 5. He's at 7 on my list. His average draft position is 62 overall. I'm most likely not going to be taking him, but that's okay. At number 8 on my list is Evan Engram, now with Denver. He's had a change of scenery. Previous two teams were the Giants and in the last couple seasons, the Jaguars. With that change of scenery and becoming a Bronco, he now gets to play with Bo Nix, who's going into his second season after having a good rookie year for a quarterback. And, of course, they get the benefit of playing in the Sean Payton offense, who, I do think Sean Payton, really great coach. That's not really disputed much at all. Super Bowl winning, got New Orleans to be in a great spot when he was with Drew Brees for all those years. And in the few short years that he's been the Broncos head coach, he's really gotten that franchise on an upward trajectory after they spent close to a decade of, not doing well after the departure of Peyton Manning. I think with that all combined, I think Evan Engram has the chance to be a top 10 tight end, near the bottom of that top 10, but really for 2024, Evan Engram really was just hampered by some injuries. That was the biggest issue for him in 2024. 2023, he had a great season for a tight end, finished with 230. 2024 only finished with 89.5. Currently, he's projected to get about 168 in fantasy for 2025. So, late end starting quarterback or starting tight end for you in fantasy. At number 9 on my list, on average, he's going 10th, is David Njoku with the Cleveland Browns. He finished 2024 with 170 points. The prior year he had gotten 201, so it was a bit of a step down. Current projections have him being a little bit closer to what he was in 2024, which I think is fair, but maybe a slight improvement though on that. He is entering his 9th season, so that's part of it. He's getting up there in age for a tight end, but he's been a top 10 tight end pretty much all of his career. Pretty much every year, the expectation has been that he would be a top 10 tight end. He finished as the tight end 6 in 2023 with those numbers I mentioned earlier. And that 2024 campaign with the low number was actually mostly due to the fact that he missed 6 games. So for the fact that he missed 6 games and still finished with 170 points in 2024, that's pretty good. And he did, when he was playing, he was averaging 13.5 fantasy points. He had he was a top 10 scorer in 7 games, with 11 games where he finished top 5 in the position. So, when he was healthy in 2024, he was definitely a top 10 and even some weeks a top 5 tight end. So, especially if he's able to stay healthy this year and be semi-consistent, even if his production drops a little bit due to age, you know, David Njoku, not a bad pick, especially where he's being drafted on average 10th for tight ends, 89th overall. Again, he's 9th on my list. I think it's a good pick. He's had a pretty good pedigree and set a pretty good precedent over his career as a fantasy tight end. So moving on to number 10 on my list, 9th on average. So these two spots are flipped from my list to the average. This is Tyler Warren, rookie tight end. One of the top 2 tight end prospects coming out into the draft this year. Either number 1 or number 2, depending on what draft analyst or what team you were to have asked. But Tyler Warren ended up with the Colts, and I do expect him to have a good. Obviously, with that type of prospect, you expect him to have a good rookie year as a tight end, and we've seen that in recent years. Tight end is definitely a position that is very open to having a rookie end up being a top 3 tight end in fantasy, so it's very possible. The biggest downside for Tyler Warren in fantasy right now is just the Colts quarterback situation. They benched Anthony Richardson, and they've announced Daniel Jones as their starting quarterback. So Daniel Jones is your starting quarterback, Anthony Richardson as your backup. Not the greatest of quarterback situations for the Colts. They seem like one of those franchises that's, half hoping that they get Arch Manning in a few years or another quarterback prospect. They've definitely given up on the Anthony Richardson thing. That's been a bust at this point. And obviously, Daniel Jones is not your long-term situation, not your long-term solution. And I'm sure even within the roster, they're probably not too excited to be having him as their starting quarterback this year. So that's the biggest issue for me with drafting Tyler Warren at tight end, is just my concerns with the quarterback that's going to, who's going to be throwing to him week to week, and how much production is that going to offer him. But whatever opportunities he gets, I do expect him to take advantage of those. And so he does have upside top 10 tight end potential, and maybe even higher as an upside. Again, it really just depends what the quarterbacks are going to be able to offer him as far as chances to produce. But that's why I've got Tyler Warren as number 10 on my list. All right, now to number 11 on my list for tight ends. The next couple picks, at least, we kind of go back to being in line with the average for my list. So at number 11, I have Tucker Kraft with the Green Bay Packers. Kraft took over at tight end 1 position for the Packers from week 12 on in 2023. So from that point, in the 27 games since, he's averaged 4.3 targets and 9.4 fantasy points per game. He's also played in 85% of Green Bay's snaps in 2024. Kraft is best seen as a tight end 2, though, with tight end 1 upside in fantasy, especially depending on the size of your league. Of course, if you're in a 12-team league or bigger, he's definitely going to be a tight end 1. But in 2024, he finished with 163.3 fantasy points. His projection currently is to be right around the same spot. He had some numbers where, for the fact that he was on 85% of the snaps for Green Bay, not quite the production level or consistency that you'd want, or would expect that he might be able to have being in that many plays. Part of it is, of course, he's a tight end. That's part of the thing with tight ends. They're not just catchers. Some of these tight ends are mostly receiving tight ends, but some tight ends are that. Some tight ends are more blocking tight ends. But on any team, they're going to expect basically all tight ends to be able to block at least to some extent. They're kind of a hybrid wide receiver, offensive lineman type of player. So even hybrid quarterback. A lot of tight ends have played quarterback in their career, in college or high school. But yeah, so for Tucker Kraft, he's 11th on my list. 11th is his average. His average draft position is at 106. Going on to number 12 on my list, 12th on average. This is Colston Loveland with the Chicago Bears. As I had mentioned earlier with Tyler Warren, one of the top 2 tight end prospects in the 2025 overall draft. Colts ended up getting Tyler Warren. Bears ended up taking Colston Loveland. I'm excited for him as a Chicago Bears fan, of course. My biggest concern fantasy-wise for Colston Loveland, and the reason I don't have him higher than his average, is just because of the fact that he is going to be sharing a tight end room with Cole Kmet. And, Cole Kmet hasn't had the greatest of fantasy seasons necessarily, and certainly in 2024, a bit of a disappointing one as far as fantasy production. And I think the signs from the fact that the Bears drafted a tight end with their first pick in the draft, I think that goes to show that Ryan Poles, the GM, and especially with the new regime in the coaching staff of Ben Johnson, definitely not too hard to read into the fact that they drafted a tight end first, with the first pick in the Ben Johnson era for the Bears. They go with a tight end. So obviously that doesn't necessarily give the biggest vote of confidence for Cole Kmet, because obviously if you were coming in as the new Bears head coach and you thought what you saw out of Cole Kmet last year was great, you probably don't pick a tight end first. Now, of course, with Ben Johnson, he is known for using 12 personnel, which does favor tight ends, as it does have 2 tight ends on the field for that personnel. And with the Lions, Ben Johnson and the Lions offense had plenty of success out of that system. So that could be to the benefit of both Cole Kmet and Colston Loveland. But that's why for me, and obviously for the average, I think 12th is semi-reasonable for Colston Loveland. It is assumed that he is going to take over that number 1 position as far as production in the passing game and things like that. And for fantasy, he's pretty much knocked Cole Kmet off the fantasy radar altogether at this moment. But that's also why, again, I'm not the most confident in taking Colston Loveland, because I do think that they could have maybe more of an equal share than some people might think, especially at least to start out. That's a possibility. So we'll just have to see. It's hard to know exactly what this Bears offense is going to look like with Ben Johnson and with the roster that they have. So I'm excited to see it. I hope it works out great. And I hope that Colston Loveland hits his upside. But again, at this position, he's really fringe starting tight end in fantasy, depending on the size of your league. If you're in a smaller league, like a 10-team league, not even really starting worthy. He's a tight end that you might take if you are going to take a backup tight end. But again, I wouldn't necessarily advise taking 2 tight ends in the draft. That's just me. Again, depending on how you've structured your roster, you might take 2 tight ends, but usually not my thing. So yeah, Colston Loveland, fringe starting tight end. Maybe you take him as a backup with the hope that he hits his upside. After week 12, for me, the rest of the tight ends here on this list, the next 3 that I have coming up, it's all really kind of a toss-up after 12 for tight ends. I mean, again, even really after 4, it's a little bit of a toss-up this year, but at least all the previous tight ends that I've mentioned, they're ones that I would suggest drafting in fantasy. The rest of these tight ends, I would really only suggest drafting if you do want to get a second tight end in the draft. But if you are like me and you're not really all that into drafting 2 tight ends, you're probably done drafting tight end at this point. And if you haven't drafted a tight end at this point, what are you doing? You've had plenty of time to draft at least one tight end, and you should have by now. Because at number 13, I do have Dalton Kincaid with the Buffalo Bills. On average, he is 13th for tight ends, and his average draft position is 124. So again, you've had plenty of rounds at this point, plenty of picks where you could have taken a good tight end. So again, at this point, you should be done drafting tight end, or if you are drafting tight end, you should be drafting your second tight end. So for Kincaid, in 2023, he did show fantasy managers that he is capable. From week 18 to week 12 in that year, he operated as the starter for the Bills and had 37 targets. However, in 2024, it was a bit of a disappointing year for Kincaid in fantasy. Although he had a great target share, and he's involved in an offense with Josh Allen, which is, of course, still the case, still an upside for him. In 2024, he really struggled with drops, and that's kind of been a struggle for him pretty much all of his career so far in the NFL. It is a young career still, so there's a chance that he's able to improve on it, but in 2024, his catch rate was 59%, which is really low. Had that percentage been at a more average rate, he might have been a starting worthy tight end, probably would have, and could have been, top 10, even closer to top 5 if he just could reel in more catches and take advantage of the targets that he is getting better. So if he's able to improve in those areas, he's certainly a fringe tight end 1. But again, just based off the history so far that he's had, I wouldn't be confident in taking him as a starting tight end really in any size league, unless you're in a really deep league, that's like 14 teams deep. But that's going to be really rare. For the most part, your league sizes are going to be 12 teams or maybe smaller at like 10. Again, 10, 12 is the most common. Otherwise, he's a fringe tight end 1 at best. But really, he's better to be drafted as a tight end 2, if you're even going to draft a tight end 2. At number 14 on my list, on average, he's going 15th. I have Jake Ferguson. Ferguson finished as the 10th overall tight end in 2023, but in 2024, he dropped all the way down to 23rd. He had 0 touchdowns in 2024 after a 2023 season where he scored 5 touchdowns. He only had 5 games with more than 10 fantasy points in 2024. He also missed 3 games, but didn't really miss that long of the season in 2024, and just didn't have very high production value at all throughout the season. So he's got decent tight end 2 potential, and if the Cowboys' offense is able to be surprisingly good, then Ferguson might be, a fringe tight end 1 for you. But again, I wouldn't be confident taking him as that. If you are going to take in a second tight end, Ferguson would be one of my first choices for that, though. But again, that's why I'm not commonly going to be taking 2 tight ends, because I just don't think there's that much depth at tight end that's worthwhile for fantasy. With that, rounding out my list, final pick on here is Dallas Goedert with the Eagles. On average, he's going 16th for tight ends with an average draft position of 137. At this point, again, at best, he's valued as a tight end 2 at this point. He did have an okay 2023 season, a disappointing 2024, rather inconsistent. He's also up there in age. He's on the wrong side of 30. He is 30, but still, that's the wrong number in age for the NFL, unfortunately, in most positions. And so he's best valued as a tight end 2, but again, fringe tight end at best for fantasy. Really outside of the top 12, I'm not going to bother drafting tight ends for very much. Again, one of these 3 that's 13 through 15, I might take one of them in one league this year or in a couple. because again, I'm doing many teams this year. Probably going to end up with like at least 5 fantasy teams this year, but yeah, I'm not going to be taking 2 tight ends in many leagues. I wouldn't suggest that you do the same, because again, I just the overall amount of fantasy points that tight ends get is just not as high as most wide receivers and running backs. So there's just, you're wasting your draft value in the picks that you have. You're wasting your value if you're drafting 2 tight ends most likely. So even later in the draft, I get it. At this point in the draft, when you're picking around 137, a lot of players that are going to be left available at that point are going to be ones that maybe already have injury concerns going on, concerns with, they might have some suspensions they're going to be serving, so some players that you're already going to be missing for part of the season, but at least those players do have the potential of, hey, you can draft them, stash them, even in your IR spot for some of them, and that when they come back, they might actually be pretty good week to week once they're back for you. Or you just take some other players in those positions that are backup worthy, that even though they're backups, backup worthy fantasy at those positions, they're likely going to be scoring more points overall in a season than a lot of these late end tight ends. So yeah, with that, I'm going to round out this video. Went a little longer than I intended, so if you made it this far, I really appreciate you. Again, don't forget to hit like on the video if you've made it this far. Of course, subscribe if you haven't. I really appreciate you. Up next for fantasy will be kickers. That'll be coming out tomorrow, so I hope you'll stick around for that and enjoy that, and I will see you in that next video.